and share my screen with you. There's record, share the screen. Okay, let me show you this video. I think you'll get a kick out of this. This is a pretty cool video. It's a UPJ obstruction, and you get to see a lot of the connective tissues of the kidney. You get to see inside the kidney stone removal. It's pretty amazing. So here you go.
This video demonstrates a robotic pyeloplasty. Here you can see incising the fascia or strength layer over the kidney. In the right hand is a monopolar scissor, in the left a dissecting forceps, and at the bottom of the field is an assistant helping. Here you can see the kidney, and we're starting to dissect out the ureter. You can see the ureter pushing a bolus of urine down towards the bladder. And in this case, the patient also had kidney stones. So before doing the reconstructive part of the surgery, we entered the renal pelvis with a flexible cystoscope. So the video has been changed from the robotic video to the video through the flexible cystoscope.
This is so cool because it's such a tiny camera. They literally cut the ureter and shoved a camera on a tube up the ureter into a renal pelvis. They're like inside the kidney with the camera. It's so cool.
Here we've entered inside the kidney where the urine is collected, and
look at all the little calyces leading to the pelvis. Does it oddly remind you of the lungs? Like when we went down into the lungs, right? It kind of grossly reminds me of lungs, but that's so cool.
These holes is called a renal calyx. We're looking through the kidney to find the kidney stones. Once the stones are located, they're grasped with a flexible basket through the cystoscope, brought out through the calyx, through the renal pelvis, through the abdomen, and out through the robotic port. In this setting, we were able to save the patient from needing 2 surgeries, one for stone removal and one for reconstruction. Now the stones have been removed, we're back to the reconstructive portion. You can see the renal pelvis contracting, trying to push urine down. Here we've separated the ureter from the renal pelvis and are placed a wire down the kidney tube or ureter, and over this, a plastic tube called a stent is placed. This is pushed all the way down to the bladder, and this stent will be in place for 6 weeks to allow the reconstructed portion to heal. The robotic arms allow great flexibility and wristed movement to do the complex steps necessary to complete this procedure. Each end of the stent has a coil, and the upper coil is tucked into the renal pelvis.
So they took that metal wire and ran this flexible pipe all the way down that metal wire and have basically created a ureter with that flexible piping, then remove the metal wire. And now this is the really cool part. If you caught that wristed movement, these little teeth can clamp shut, but they can also rotate, right? Do you guys remember trying to sew up those bananas with the suture lab with the Grand Canyon folks? They're going to do that with robotic arms that they're controlling. So you can imagine that's going to be kind of tricky, but it's pretty cool to watch.
And here we're sewing the healthy ureter back to the healthy renal pelvis. And at the conclusion, we'll remove the unhealthy portion that was causing the UPJ obstruction in the first place. Once things are almost completely sewn up, the abnormal segment is excised and removed. This will be sent for pathology to look for any abnormal muscular segments consistent with uteropelvic junction obstruction. Here we're finishing up the reconstruction, sewing the ureter back to the renal pelvis. The stent remains in place underneath. You can see with the robotic arms, things like wristed movement for sewing or knot tying is made much easier. And we get one last contraction from the renal pelvis and ureter. Now that the reconstruction is complete, we'll close the fascia back up over the kidney with some clips, and we'll place a drain in the bed of the surgery in the case of urine leak to be sure that the
There you go. So there's a 2-for-1. I don't know what ureter necessarily. It sounds like they were sending off to pathology, so maybe they were expecting some sort of cancer or something along those lines. But definitely cool that you get to see both the pardon me, kidney stone removal and the inside of the kidney, and where the ureter comes out, and patching in that kind of restructuring of that ureter, which was kind of a cool deal. So a lot in that one video. So this is what you saw right here was the renal calyces leading into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then leads out into the ureter, and that's what we just saw in that video. And those stones were up here, and they were able to actually go in and sort of catch those with that little wire mesh you saw could shrink down into that instrument and kind of net them and pull them out, which is a pretty cool deal there. So some terms you should know, you already kind of know from your labeling, but the renal pelvis is a basin where basically all of the calyces meet and all the urine is collected before it gets to the ureter. The calyx leads to the pelvis. So calyces are much smaller, and that leads to the pelvis, and the urine comes through calyces. The renal medulla is a word you guys already have, and the cortex you already have. Medulla just means middle, and cortex means outside. And so as long as you know those, I'm very happy with that. So that's medulla and cortex, which you've already labeled. So if you want to write them down, you can. If you're content with the diagrams you have, then by all means, just run with the diagrams that you have. All right. I see a couple folks writing, so I'm just going to wait just a second before we cruise on here. All right, everybody feel okay about medulla and cortex? Middle and the outside? Awesome. All right, so let's talk about the blood supply. The blood obviously comes in through renal arteries. The renal artery is a pretty big artery. It's going to bring blood to the kidneys from that abdominal aorta, which we already talked about in our diagrams. It's going to get about 1/4 of your cardiac output every minute, which is a lot. If you consider, what your heart pumps out every minute, about 1/4 of that's actually going to go to your kidneys. That's a considerable amount of blood for what a small organ we're fueling, compared to your skeletal muscles, right? A kidney's that big, and your skeletal muscles are your whole body, and the kidney's getting 1/4 of your blood because it's filtering that blood plasma. And so their job is very, very, very important. That renal artery does branch into lobar arteries, which lead to the renal sinus, which was that cavity that the pelvis sits in, which is kind of tough. Renal pelvis, renal sinus. Sinus is the cavity in that concave side, and the pelvis sits in that renal sinus. The lobar arteries branch into interlobar arteries, which go between the renal pyramids, and then to arcuate arteries and small interlobar arteries, and smaller until we get to our afferent arteriole. And so I don't care so much that you necessarily memorize like in order. Lobar arteries goes to interlobar, goes to arcuate, goes to small interlobar. That's not my concern really. As long as you get the idea that we're getting a lot of blood supply to the kidneys, and that our goal is to get to an afferent arteriole. So the arteries get smaller and smaller as you go, and that's hopefully makes a lot of sense. So I really like this diagram. I don't like it enough to put it on a test, but man, I like this diagram. It is so cool. So here you have your renal artery, right? Big old artery coming into the kidney. That branches off into segmental arteries that you guys have already labeled. The segmental arteries then branch off into interlobar arteries. Interlobar arteries branch off into arcuate arteries. Arcuate arteries are these guys that run in the arc like that. Maybe red wasn't the best color there, but that's okay. And so that's your arcuate arteries. And then even smaller arteries, the cortical radiate, which is not one you have to memorize. Actually, out of these, I'm not that concerned that you memorize any of them. Arcuate would be nice. It travels the arc. That's pretty easy. You should know arcuate. But the arcuate artery branches off into even smaller arteries. And those are going to give you, basically, if you zoomed in further here, here's a nephron, here's a nephron. There's going to be about 1 million of them. So these are way too big. But to get the idea across, you would branch off into afferent arterioles. Let's just say this is Bowman's capsule. Again, way too big, but whatever. Let's say it's Bowman's capsule. And your afferent arteriole would run into there. And then through that capillary, and then it would come back through the veins in the same order: arcuate veins, interlobar veins, lobar veins, segmental veins, renal veins. So if you know all the artery names, then getting back through the veins is the same exact thing. So kind of a cool three-dimensional picture of that kidney and how we get a blood supply to it. Any questions on blood supply? Feel okay with it? Cool. All right. So some other things you should know. Arcuate arteries are the blood vessels that run between the cortex and the medulla. I would like you to know those. That's a pretty logical one. So between the inside layer and the outside layer, running in that arc of the kidney is the arcuate arteries. They eventually are going to branch to afferent arterioles. I would like you to know afferent arterioles, because afferent arterioles are the direct feed into that capillary bed we call the glomerulus. And so I do want you to know the afferent arterioles, because that's where we're really getting to the filtration piece of this. Once we get to the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, then we're into the really cool piece of what these kidneys are actually doing. Everything else has been a smaller tube leading to a smaller tube leading to a smaller tube to get us to the nephron. This guy's the smallest tube at the nephron, and that's where you want to be. Okay, so arcuate arteries and afferent arterioles. Those are your heavy hitters, in my opinion. I just see a lot of writing, so I'm just going to wait. I want to click on too quick. Have I put this PowerPoint on Edmodo yet? I will check that, because I should put that on there. Some people are nodding their head yes. Wonderful. I'll check. Because it's super easy for you to follow along if you just want to do that as well. Or, you save you some writing time. All right, cool. So that's blood supply. Now this guy right here, love this diagram, super cool diagram. Here we have that interlobar, the small interlobular artery, which comes into the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole comes in and forms this capillary bed we call the glomerulus, okay? The glomerulus is where we're actually going to keep the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets, all that stuff stays in your blood, but the watery plasma portion is actually squeezed out of your bloodstream into Bowman's capsule. That's the goal. So all along this capillary, we are creating enough pressure to squeeze out the fluid from our bloodstream, which is kind of amazing if you think about it, but keep the red blood cells in the blood. Keep the white blood cells in. You don't want any of that stuff going out to urine, but all of the dissolved like nitrates and ammonia and urea and those kinds of things can actually be squeezed out of that capillary bed. Once we're done with the capillary bed, we are going to leave from the efferent arteriole. And there's a lot of crazy stuff going on here, so we'll leave that alone for now because we're talking about blood supply. We move into peritubular capillaries, which I would like you to know. Peritubular capillaries literally mean the tiny blood vessels around the tube. As far as this being vasorecta and this being peritubular capillaries, that doesn't bother me too much. All of this, I'm trying to draw this. Sorry, it takes me a bit to draw. There we go. All of that is peritubular capillaries, that whole section there. And so if you know that, we're going to be in great shape. Now, if you tried to track this blood flow, it'd be tough because there's a lot of branches. Being capillary, like by definition, there's a ton of branches. But basically, the blood is flowing this way, okay, through the capillary. Pick a route. Let's say we go down this way, okay, and we are reabsorbing water. We're reabsorbing calcium. We're reabsorbing useful salts. And then the blood goes this way, and then the blood goes this way, and then the blood goes this way. And eventually we get back to a point where we're a vein. Okay, now this is not so much like, well, this organ is extracting tons of oxygen and giving you tons of CO2, and that's why we have to change the color. Not really. Muscles certainly do, and to a certain extent, kidneys do as well. But really, you could change this blue almost whenever you wanted to, because the goal here is not so much gas exchange as it is ion exchange, fluid exchange. So we reabsorb water. If you're staying hydrated, you're drinking a ton of water throughout the day, you don't reabsorb a lot of water. Your urine will be almost clear because you don't need to reabsorb water. You regulate that with your hormones. If you're super dehydrated and you decide, well, today I'm not drinking any water because I want to have kidney stones, take that, Mr. Stecker, and you just go all day without drinking water, then your body's going to conserve a lot of water because it knows there's not a lot of water coming in. So all these peritubular capillaries are going to be pulling water out of this loop of Henle and putting it back in your bloodstream to try to save it. And it's weird, but you can see that because it's pulled so much water out of those peritubular capillaries that the urine that you had is becoming more concentrated. There's less water and more salts, and the urine color will change. It'll be a darker yellow. It'll smell stronger. It's the same ions and salts that you were going to get rid of anyway. The only difference is because you were dehydrated, you absorb more water and kept more water in your bloodstream than you could if you were drinking, a gallon of water a day or 2 gallons a day. You'd be urinating every 20 minutes and it'd be super clear, right? So that's kind of the point of the peritubular capillaries. So they come out this little tiny vein here and goes into the same, names we just had for arteries go to veins. So small interlobular and arcuate, interlobular, what's the other one? Segmental, back to the renal vein, okay? So again, I don't care, you don't have to know them in order. It might be a cool bonus question maybe, but that's the point of the whole vasculature coming around this peritubular capillary. Tori.
So I know the more that you drink more water, the less you have to go to the bathroom. So is that what happens?
The more water you drink, the less you have to go to the bathroom?
Or no, so if I'm deciding I'm going to drink so much more water.
Sure.
I do that for the next month. I'm going to have to go to the bathroom less in a month than I did now. Because I know in track season, we're okay, I got to drink water now. And then we have to go to the bathroom every 15 minutes. But then right. At the end of track season, between
You've
periods.
Adapted?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I've never been asked that question, honestly, Tori. I have no idea. I guess I'll have to make a little experiment. I'll try to drink a gallon of water a day and keep a little journal. I have no idea. That's a great question. My assumption would be if you're putting that much water in, you're going to be going to the bathroom a lot. I can't imagine that would change, but I mean, track season's a month and a half, so maybe I don't know what would change that, but that's a tricky question there. I don't have the answer for that. That's a great question.
It's Darwin's finches, but with people.
It's Darwin's finches, but with people. Yes. If the best track runners survive and drinking more water makes you the best track runner, eventually all humans will have larger bladders and also be fast. I don't know how that works. That's a tough one there. Yeah, that's a great question. All right. Any other questions? We're about at the half-hour mark, guys. I apologize for I used a lot of our time for best, worst, and weirdest, but I do like to kind of check in on you a little bit.